Over to you, Warwick.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the January AHSA Queensland meeting brought to you by Zoom. We're now considering restarting physical meetings at Archerfield from next month. Peter and I will be talking with the people at Archerfield Airport Corporation and we're going to see how well that will work. And if it's feasible to be able to Zoom a physical meeting as well, we'll do that if we can. We'll let everybody know what the score is and what will be happening. Our February speaker will be Rochelle Nichols, her topic, the Korean Kid, about a RAF pilot Jim Kirsten's side, flying in Korea with 77 Squadron and later flying in Antarctica and Southeast Asia. Then in March, Noel Dennett, who has spoken with us before, will be talking about, his topic will be flying a Boeing 747 from Bangkok to London. And in April, Mark Clayton, his topic will be the discovery of a missing World War II American bomber. A physical thing we're hoping to do with the Queensland group, or planning to do, in May is a site bishop to Brad Bishop's Fighter Pilot Adventure World at Archerfield, where they've got the new Spitfire and the Mustang and several other interesting aircraft. We'll, of course, keep everyone well informed about what will be happening on that. A separate thing for the Queensland members only, the others can shut your ears. We'll be having a annual general meeting shortly, and we won't be having a guest speaker on that, but we'll have the AGM, which will be fairly short, and then a general chat session for our members. But local members will be told more about that. So go back to you, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks, Warwick. Thanks, everyone. Actually, just a reminder too that I'm giving a talk for the RAF historical group, History and Heritage, this Friday week, starting at 9 a.m. This coming Friday, and I'll be talking on the Heritage listed Hangar 7 at Eagle Farm Airfield and the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit that were based there, rebuilding captured Japanese aircraft and flying them around Brisbane during World War II. And I'll also be showing some very rare footage of a Zero, an actual Zero flying around Brisbane during World War II. So that's next Friday. So tonight's speaker is...
Sorry, Peter, just before we go on, is that going to be on Zoom?
Yeah, I'll send it. Oh. I'll send the info out. I've already sent it, in fact.
Oh, thanks very much. Great.
Okay, tonight's speaker is Paul Goodwin. Paul is a writer who lives in Sydney, having had a long and very successful career in marketing and executive positions. Paul started in arts and law before finding his true vocation. 20 years spent working for companies such as Reckitt and Coleman, SC Johnson and Uncle Toby's, reaching marketing director level. He then took on chief executive roles, running a large private hospital for Maine Nicholas. He ran the student union for Macquarie University and GROW, the Area Consultative Committee for Sydney, which provided project grants to the communities of Sydney for the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Paul Goodwin, whose talk tonight is titled The Last Navigator. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm just bringing up my PowerPoint and to make sure I get everything right here for you. So I do, sorry, Peter, I do share screen.
Yep.
Okay, click on that.
Then run the video, then run the PowerPoint.
We're away. Look, firstly, thanks to Warwick and Don Furlonger and Peter for setting this up. It is a pleasure for me to be able to talk to you, particularly as my father was a proud Queenslander and hailed from Montville, but his roots were very much in Queensland. He was a boy from the bush. I'm going to read you just a little bit at the start of the book, just honestly to give you a bit of a flavour for I suppose, the writing, but what I felt he actually went through. I spent most of my time listening to him telling me about these experiences. So just let me read a couple of paragraphs for you. This is from the author's note. Facing an aircraft on fire at the end of the runway, flames erupting from black mushroom clouds in burnt orange, you prepare to take off on your second attempt at crossing the Atlantic. 2,000 miles in a fuel-laden Lockheed Hudson on your way to war from training in Canada. Special tanks filled to the gunnels to make the distance. Your second operation in a Wellington bomber and first over enemy territory. Suddenly out of the pitch black comes a strange and frightening blue shaft of light, picking your aircraft out of the sky. Coned by between 10 and 50 searchlights, locking on and lighting up the cockpit like daylight. You're surrounded by exploding flak, trying to blast you from the heavens with its tumultuous shattering sound. The skipper drops the bomber out of the night sky. You fear your plane ditching into the ice-cold waters of the English Channel, being the only survivor in a life raft tossing in the dark, roiling ocean, awaiting possible sea rescue in the dead of night. The choking, tightening feeling of being trapped in a burning Lancaster, enduring the uncertainty. You count down the requisite 60 seconds for the tanks to blow. Your skip has thrown off the fighters with yet another brilliant corkscrew manoeuvre. But will you get your badly wounded bomber home? The last nail-biting trip over Berlin. You briefly ponder how you managed to survive the last 8, attempting to bring the big city, as Berlin was called, to its knees and end the war. You feel your chances for survival have moved to 0. These are but some of the memories of my father, Gordon Goodwin, a squadron leader with Bomber Command and member of the Pathfinders, the corps d'elite who led the way in virtually every major bomber operation for the last 3 years of the war in Europe. So that's just to give you just sort of a bit of a feel. It is sort of a very important time in history, but there aren't many left to actually now tell the story. So it's important that I felt that this book gets out there, but more importantly that we continue to tell the story of Bomber Command and Pathfinders. My father completed his memoirs in 1997, and he was 80, but they were very matter of fact and emotionless. I sort of count myself lucky that when I retired, I needed a project, and I sort of took this book on and sat with him for the last 5 years of his life. And he, in the earlier days, he didn't really open up too much. He wouldn't tell many stories. They were all sort of matter of fact, oh, I survived, this happened. But for some reason, once he got into his 90s, it was the main focus of his life. He was still reading Bennett's book on World War II about Pathfinders. In fact, it was the last book he read. So he really focused on it and started to talk about his experiences. And I was lucky enough to be there and to take them down and then turn them into a book. So I feel very much this book is a joint venture between the two of us, but very much his words. And anywhere I can, I've used his words exactly as he had them in the memoir. He also had an extensive library of books, which is just over here. I was so lucky. And he had all his flying logs, documents, and the lifetime of conversations. So, I mean, what could I do? It was like a bequest, you know. I couldn't hurl them out. I had to do something with them. And basically that's what I did. And also I should say, my dear mother wrote also some stories of her experiences. She was a London girl and survived 3 near-death experiences and came to Australia very bravely on a ship all the way to the other side of the world. So she's in the story as well. My father grew up in Montville. He had a very harsh beginning. His father was an overseer in Fiji, and one of those people that likes to order people about but not do too much himself. And he sort of saw my father as his lackey and someone who could work for him. He came back from Fiji and had purchased an orange orchard, and it had a number of oranges growing, and he decided that my father, even though my father had done very well at school, in fact had been offered a scholarship from Brisbane Boys College, he decided he needed him on the property, so took him out of school at age 12. So sort of forsook my father's education for the sake of his own needs. But my poor father used to be dispatched to the bush, and he would be told to go and hunt for pigeon and all manner of things to feed the family. And of course, the depression came during these years, and it was pretty critical that my father helped with the food intake. There's a rather nice story in the book too, which I took exactly from my father's memoir, about a carpet snake that my father bagged. It was 15 feet 8 inches long, and he was out by himself at age 12 in the bush with his rifle, and this thing reared up from behind a log, and he shot it clean from the hip with his rifle, and then skinned it. And they had enough money, I think, to pay for fertilizer for a week from this skin. They were used for handbags and things. Not too much more about his background, but it was his uncle Stan, who was a general manager at the Bundaberg sugar mill, that saved him. He suggested to his my father's father that he would be better off letting my father Gordon come to Bundaberg to work, and that in fact my father could send a bit of money home. So he cunningly convinced him to give my father a chance, and so he did. He went to Bundaberg and he trained in the mill as a sugar boiler and became qualified. And that sort of essentially was what gave him his chance in life. He had this technical qualification, which would allow him, even though he'd only gone to school till age 12, this technical qualification that proved he was smart and that he could do things. So it actually got him into the Empire training scheme. But I'm probably getting slightly ahead of myself. He joined the militia in Bundaberg, and there's some rather exquisite stories about his experiences there in the book. But one of the ones I liked was his descriptions of the using the Vickers machine gun, and how you can see from the diagram there how it actually is plunging fire. It actually, you have to be able to bring the bullets down on the target. And there was I think it was a crew of 6, but they used to have to change the barrels and do all sorts of things, but an amazing output of, I think, more than 2 bullets a second this thing could fire. So he did things like that. He trained in the militia and was very lucky to get into the Empire training scheme. I think 2 months, within 2 months, he made it there. Had he not, he would have, I think at that stage, he was then a full sergeant with the 8th Division AIF, and they were the ones that went to Singapore and were eventually in Changi, and I don't think many of those came home. So he was just lucky to, because of his experience, to get into the Empire training scheme. And that firstly was in Sydney, no flying at that stage, but just training. He qualified at that level and started training as a Navigator bomb aimer in Canada. So he was sent to Canada then to train as a Navigator bomb aimer. And that's a credit to him, in that most of the people that got onto those courses were high school, at least high school trained, and probably had some further qualification. So we sort of move on to training in Canada. And I can't spend too long on all of these things, but it's well documented. He talks of his first flight in an Avro Anson, which I found fascinating, about his training. In a ferry battle, he does bombing and gunnery training. And the wonderful thing he described to me about the gunnery side. Don't think he ever fired a gun after that training because he was a navigator. But there was a skip who told him, what you do is you follow the aircraft. This is trying to get the maximum score for your hits. There used to be a drogue that another aircraft towed, and you waited till that aircraft turned, and the drogue would sit momentarily stationary, and then you absolutely pump it full of bullets. Well, that's exactly what he did. And of course, his skip had apoplexy because he thought he nearly shot down the other aircraft. But so there's some very nice stories about that. In Canada, he meets a guy called Don Bennett, and he was running Atlantic Ferry Command. And my father met Bennett a few times in his war experiences. He was lastly at Pathfinders. In fact, my father did actually meet him after the war too. But as you may remember, Bennett established the Pathfinders and really set them up to be the success they were. But Bennett was a Queenslander and a very clever man, a very accomplished pilot. But he also loved navigation, and that's where the Pathfinders was lucky to have him, because he really knew navigation. In fact, he wrote, the story goes, a book on navigation on his way home from his honeymoon on a ship. So he not only was a very accomplished pilot, you can read his history in the book as well, flying well before the war and setting records and things. But he also was a very accomplished navigator and knew the power of good navigation. So the thing I wanted to tell you about too was the Hudson aircraft. My father, once he's completed his training in Canada, they select some to go by ship into war and some to fly the aircraft. Well, my father was chosen to navigate a Hudson to Scotland, and they head off from Labrador, close to Newfoundland, that sort of area. And the idea is they have to fly this aircraft to Scotland so it can be used in the Coastal Command. And these aircraft were pulled over the border from America and to Canada, and then they could legally sort of fly them out. But on the first attempt, they sort of reach nearly the point of no return. One of the engines plays up, so they're over the Atlantic, and you know the Atlantic is a fairly unforgiving place. Not many aircraft at that stage had flown the Atlantic. There was quite a high attrition rate for aircraft flying the Atlantic, and the weather patterns were pretty demanding, horrendous, strong winds. So they get to that point, and he's asked, this is his first sort of real flight as a navigator, Gordon, do we keep on going or do we turn back? And it's basically a decision on the distance travelled and the effect of the weather. There were strong headwinds at that stage. So they decide to turn back, and they finally make it back successfully. Second time round, they're about to take off. Now, these Hudsons were small aircraft, but loaded to the gunnels with fuel. So the whole centre of the aircraft has got a tank in it, and they're very heavy and very hard to get off the ground. Well, they're waiting to take off for the second time, and the Hudson in front goes hurtling down the runway and fails to take off. Crashes into the barrier, and fortunately the crew race out the back. They were ready to go. They must have known what was happening. So my father's aircraft, having had a problem the first time, they then just wait while they sort of put that plane out. Half an hour later, they take off themselves, and they actually make it there, but they only make it as far as Ireland. And my father realised that with the strong headwinds, they would not have made it with one engine to, they wouldn't have made Ireland, yet alone Scotland. So they had to land in Ireland to refuel, and then they went on to Scotland. So he makes it to war after a couple of sort of difficult experiences. You would think war is hard enough, but this was just flying a Hudson across the Atlantic. So that gets me to the war itself. And I suppose you have a picture there before you of a Wellington bomber. And that was the first aircraft that he flew in, a medium bomber, not as powerful as the Lancaster, but quite a successful bomber. So the first trick and the way they used to do it, I'm sure all of you know a lot of this stuff. Bear in mind, I'm not trying to be an expert. I'm the vehicle, the conduit to tell my father's story. So I'm just, if you like, passing on what he actually told me. But he said the way they formed the crews, they put them all in a room together and let them find 6 people from each designation to form the crew. So fortunately, he's met this guy, Arthur Doubleday, who's a very successful pilot. He was a bush guy from Coolamon in New South Wales, quite well known. This is the formation of 460 Squadron, which is the first Australian RAAF squadron in the Air Force, in the European theatre. So they're the very first all-Australian squadron. And Arthur asks my father to join him. He knows he's pretty well qualified as a navigator. And so off they go. You'll remember the Wellington was quite a bizarre aircraft. It was made of, I think it was like a canvas covered in a sort of is it a butyrol, something like that? It's almost like a butter solution, which sounds ridiculous to me. But it was a geodesic design where they had triangular supports all around the aircraft. So they were held together obviously by the frame of the aircraft, but the fabric was on the outside, and there are some amazing stories of guys climbing out on wings and things and kicking holes in the side so they can get out to fix the engine. You know, there's some quite incredible stories, but that's all in the book and my father's rendition of that. So first mission, they turn back. Yet again, the problems of mechanics, they have a problem with one engine, so they never make it over enemy territory. Operation number 2, they're out and about, and that's why it says coned by searchlights, flak to blast you from the heavens, first time in a Wellington bomber over enemy territory. My father explained to me what it was like looking down. And in those days, the Navigator was also the bomb aimer. But suddenly out of nowhere comes a blue light, firstly, which is trying to work out exactly your height. Once they've got your height, then the flak opens up and they can blast you from the sky. Well, he said he's never had such a nerve-wracking experience. Firstly, this blue light just penetrating their craft. Secondly, suddenly all the searchlights open up and light the aircraft up like it's daylight. And then the flak opens up and the sounds. He talked to me of the sounds of warfare, more so than all the other experiences, just the sounds of flak, the sounds of bullets ripping into the fuselage, the sheer brutality of it, the sound of shearing metal. And it was quite a sort of a frightening experience. So that was his first experience over enemy territory in a Wellington bomber. You'll probably all know as well that Butch Harris, who was running Bomber Command at that stage, was desperate to try and get 1,000 bombers together to take on the industrial sites of Germany. And I think in May 42, he makes the first raid on Cologne, and 460 Squadron sends 18 aircraft, one of which my father was in. So that was the first 1,000 bomber raid, and that was the start, if you like, of having a real impact on the war, and Harris suddenly getting the resources he needed. Just to remind you that we're dealing with humanity here. Here we have human beings going up in aircraft, trying to survive and trying to carry out their duty. This is my father's sort of area that he actually covered. That's where I've got all the different locations of the stations he was at and the targets. There are about 40 targets. But essentially, you can see that he ended up doing 65 operations over enemy territory. There were 32 with Pathfinders, and I'll tell you a bit about Pathfinders in a minute, but they're the ones who, in the end, went in and marked the targets. And the Germans were very keen to discourage and blow them up if they could, because they didn't want the targets marked. And then he had 9 missions to Berlin as well. And he described to me how difficult it was. In previous cities, they were able to set them on fire and really create havoc. Berlin was just too big and it was very hard. They did a lot of damage and diverted a lot of fighter aircraft, but it was just too difficult to wipe it out as they'd hoped to. They were hoping to force Hitler to actually end the war. So just to remind you, the odds were stacked against you. There was, I think, alive and unhurt, less than 50% of the crew made it through 50 operations. That was, in a Wellington bomber, that was roughly how the odds sort of worked out. And my father, in his training in Sydney, actually, there was a guy called Scrubber Scott who just said to them, he gave them this tip. He said, in order to survive, you basically have to give up all hope. Give up all hope. And that's the way they sort of got through. They didn't think about what could happen. They just focused on the job in hand. And I remember Arthur Doubleday, or my father telling me, he just said to him once, I don't expect to survive this, in a very matter-of-fact way. But that's the way they dealt with it. And they were, you know, men in their early 20s. So, you know, they had a great maturity and a great way of dealing with it. My father finally gets to squadron leader level after the end of his service with the Wellington bombers. So I'll now take you to the Pathfinders, which is 7 Squadron. This is, I suppose they were the elite group. They were meant to be the best crews who could take their aircraft in before the main force, and they would mark the targets. Now, target marking was the use of flares and all sorts of other very clever devices where the main force would be told exactly where to bomb. The success rate of the Wellington bombers, this was the first tour my father did, 31 operations. The success rate was, they reckoned in 30 operations, only 10% of the crews ever hit the target. Only 10% ever hit the target. So you can imagine they weren't having as big an impact for all the resources they were putting in and all the people they were losing. They got this guy, Don Bennett, to set up the Pathfinders. This is Butch Harris. He has a lot of time for Bennett, an Australian, a Queenslander. And Bennett gets the boffins and the experts on radar to put together a whole range of devices so that the Pathfinder force can go in and mark the targets. They actually used a lot of the British fireworks experts to design these devices. They even included parachute flares for bombing when there was wind, and the bombers would bomb to the parachute flares. A whole range of very clever devices to help them actually improve their rate. There was better radar. They had a whole range of different radar devices. They're better explained in the book. I won't try and do it now because I think I'll just confuse probably myself and you as well. But basically, Bennett and the Pathfinders really start to make a difference. You can imagine Hitler's not too much worried at that stage, but once these 1,000 bomber groups go over and start to really have an effect, area bombing I'll come to later, but the idea was as happened in Coventry, you may know in the early part of the war, Coventry was wiped out because both the civilian and the factory areas were impacted by the bombing. And that was the answer. You had to wipe out not only the factories, but also, I suppose, the civilian workers, make it hard for them to resume production. Now, there's a bit of controversy over all of that, but nevertheless, it was war, and that was what had to be done. If it hadn't been done, Hitler would have kept generating all these munitions. They were doing far better than the Allies in terms of production, and there may have been a sort of a different outcome. You've got to remember, at the end of 1940, I think, there was talk of a treaty, trying to get a treaty with Hitler. So this is after Dunkirk, so he wouldn't invade England. So it was a bit knife-edge sort of stuff. And Bomber Command, I think, as they started to bite with their bombing, really turned the tide of the war and diverted a lot of the German fighter force away from the Russian front, and helped to slow things down for Hitler and make it very difficult for him. I'll briefly mention Philip Patrick. He was my father's skip in 7 Squadron, an amazing man. I've met him, I've talked with him. He lived to 104. He was the last surviving crew member of 7 Squadron. My father was the second last. I used to see them. They used to come out from England, and he used to keep sending my father books on Bomber Command and what was the latest in England. They used to joke, and I'll come to this a bit later, joke about the lack of recognition of Bomber Command by Churchill, and particularly the lack of a clasp or an actual medal that every other service got. So Philip Patrick, though, he was a Scotsman, but a most brilliant pilot. Flying a Lancaster, he would be able to push it to its very absolute limits, as my father described it. Going through corkscrew maneuvers, a whole range of maneuvers, and avoid the enemy or get rid of the fighters. But he just had such a skill, and it was the skill of the crew, and I think also the gunners, the 2 Jemmies in that aircraft were brilliant gunners, and they saw off so many fighters. So to get through the war, if you had a really good crew and a really good pilot, you had a very good chance. But it was certainly Don Bennett who orchestrated the Pathfinder activity, and it was he who you could give a very strong credit for the success of Bomber Command. I've just got a little bit on the Lancaster. It's a bit of a love of mine. I've written there's a chapter in the book about the Lancaster, and I made my father describe to me in detail where you entered and how you went through the aircraft, what you saw, where each crew member sat, what they did. It's all in there, and I just wanted to know that stuff because I sort of knew generally about a Lancaster. I'd seen G for George at the War Memorial, but I hadn't heard all the detail. The other thing just to see on the screen there is the corkscrew maneuver, which was the most amazing maneuver. A lot of the German fighter pilots said how they just couldn't follow a Lancaster down. Once they pulled that corkscrew maneuver, it was too dangerous. They were fearful they'd collide with the aircraft, that they'd maybe come into contact with bombs and things. But you can see it was quite a seesawing activity, and it would be the gunners who'd call it. They'd see a fighter come in and they'd say corkscrew left or corkscrew right. And the gunners were ready. They knew that where the aircraft would be in relation to the fighter, and they'd call it and then be ready to shoot the whatever out of the fighter, being in a sort of a better position. But the fighters found it very difficult to actually follow them down. But there's a lot more on the Lancaster, and probably I can't go on sort of too much. The other thing I liked my father described was about the WAF, and they drove the bomb trolleys. They They did a whole range of things. They drove the bus that would drop them at the aircraft and say, "Bye bye, lovies, you know, we'll give Hitler my love," or something. But the funny anecdote he told me about was the parachutes. You know, they'd go in and pick up a parachute before they went on a mission, and they'd say, "Oh well, if it's no good, bring it back and we'll give you another one." So that was the you know, the humour that was sort of abounding there. I'll briefly mention the ground crew. I think Arthur Doubleday particularly and Philip, they all recognised the contribution the ground crews made. The ground crews almost set the aircraft up. They were letting the flyers borrow the aircraft for the mission. It was their aircraft and they had great pride in it, but they did amazing things in preserving them. And any celebrations, I think once at the conclusion of the first tour, the Arthur Doubleday makes a point of getting all the ground crew to come to the pub and celebrate. Don't want to go on too long. I probably am a little bit behind, so I'll just speed up a bit. My mother was there. She was a London girl. She was nearly killed 3 times. Once by a strafing, she ran out and thought it was a friendly aircraft and it was a German fighter, and they tried to mow her down. She was lying asleep in an area. She worked for ICI out of London, and a German bomber decided to, it hadn't dropped its bomb, so just decided to unload. And a 4,000-pound bomb went straight through my mother's bedroom down to the kitchen below, but didn't explode. So she peered down and survived that. And the third thing, there's a photo there of Wimbledon Park where my mother lived, and a V1 rocket. She was the last into the Morrison shelter, and a V1 rocket went just into the street near the house and just leveled the whole house. So she was the last in, and because they didn't put the grill up, they could get them out quickly before all the rubble collapsed, and she survived. So it wasn't just the flyers, if you like, the people in Bomber Command who survived difficult experiences. It was you know, the civilians there, and very, very hard. Okay, I'll move. I lost my little, there we go. My father was then nearly shot down. They were on their way to Augsburg, and this new technique had been developed where Junkers would come up beneath the Lancaster, directed by radar at night, and they'd use these upward firing guns pointing up from the Junkers. They'd line up beneath and try and shoot out the tanks. If they hit the tank, you had 60 seconds to get out. So what happened, and I've got the 2 people here, the 2 Jimmies there bailed out, and they bailed out within 60 seconds. They were the tail and mid-upper gunner. They bailed out. My father and the rest of the crew tried to get out. There was a material called window, which was thrown out of the aircraft to divert the German radar on a mission, and it jammed the escape hatch, so they couldn't get out. So they were stuck there, and they realised after 60 seconds that although the plane was on fire, that it wasn't the tanks, and they went back and found it was the hydraulics on fire and put out the hydraulics, and they had to fly it home, but it had no instruments, and they virtually limped home. My father took them in on an indirect route to avoid any enemy attacks, but they were very lucky to make it home. Briefly, these are escape photos. What I found fascinating is the son of Philip actually sent these to me, and he said they made them up so that if you did have to bail out, you could use them for you know, documents and things like that. So I'll keep on going. Black Thursday and Berlin. Black Thursday, probably I can't go into all the detail, but there was very bad fog and they'd predicted it. But on the return, it was totally blanket fog. And you've got 400 aircraft trying to get back down over each airfield, and they're at 500 feet in intervals. And my father's aircraft, they're told to divert to Marham because they're nearly out of fuel. It's a long way to Berlin. All the aircraft are just sort of either running out or having trouble. So 5 minutes to Marham, my father gets tells him the direction to get the aircraft there. The flight engineer, Wally, does an amazing job of recalibrating all the fuel so that he can get the extra bit of fuel. And they come out of the fog with about 50 feet to spare, and Philip lands it. And again, it's a credit to him. He was such a brilliant pilot that he could bring it down, but he did. And then they're on the field, and of course another Lanc comes hurtling through out of the fog and nearly crashes into them. So it was just so many touch and go experiences that I've never experienced in my life, but they just seem to sort of keep coming. They then found, I think there was a part of the war where over Berlin, it's quite soul destroying. This is where I think I said to you earlier that a lot of the crew start to lose heart because it's such an unforgiving experience. You know, you're not able to really bring Berlin to its heels, and you're going over this very highly defended city each time, and the chances of survival, my father felt, had moved to about zero. They all thought they wouldn't get out of it. Now Harris realizes this, and suddenly they moved to southern German targets. So they're sort of saved. But nine missions over Berlin, I can assure you, from the way my father described it, was he was lucky to get out of it. But what they did do is actually cost Hitler the war. I think, as I said earlier, he had to divert so much fighter activity. The other thing too, at this stage, and again, this is in the book, my father described the frenzy of fighters, the use of SN2 radar and the tame bore technique, where the Germans started following the squadrons right from the coast, and they could pick them out with radar that was located on the actual fighter itself. So they were starting to get hit rates and success rates, the fighters, that made it a very costly sort of part of the war. So he then moves to 635 Squadron. He has a few training sessions where he's in charge of training in navigation, but funnily enough, he marries my mother. There's a big thing about marriage and whether one should or shouldn't get married. But he decides to get married, but then decides also to return once more for his final 10 operations. So, but he's not just flying with experienced crews. He chose to fly with the inexperienced crews. If he could get a crew through 5 operations, they had a good chance of making it the rest of the way. And so he would go wherever he was needed and fly with inexperienced crews, but give advice and use his techniques as a squadron leader to get them through. But he also, survived that, and he talked to me of Duisburg. I think that was the last double raid, and it was in fact bigger, more successful than Hamburg. I think Hamburg was seen by Bennett as one of the most successful bombing operations, but they dropped more bombs on Duisburg and essentially crippled the city. But it was important at that stage. They were trying to, again, stop the war sooner. He then finishes his tour, so he's done his 65 operations. He is moved to be the chief ground instructor for Pathfinders. So at the end of that tour, he is made the chief ground instructor. Medals and recognition. The father got the Distinguished Flying Medal from King George at Buckingham Palace. He got the Distinguished Service Order for services to Pathfinders. Churchill, as I mentioned, didn't even talk of Bomber Command in his 1945 victory speech. All the other services were talked of. The reason possibly is that he was seeking civilian re-election, and bombing civilians was not popular. So he thought himself, maybe, well, I wonder if he did, he thought it better not to recognise it. To the point, there's a commemorative medal, the second there from the left-hand side, that both Bennett and Harris commissioned. And this was an unofficial commemorative medal to recognise the people of Bomber Command and Pathfinders. So I think it was in the 60s that was commissioned. And finally, in June 2012, Queen Elizabeth opens the Bomber Command Memorial at Green Park. So can you imagine 2012? It's actually the year my father died. So he was 94, and he just saw in June, before he went in July, that what he'd done was actually formally recognised. And there was also, you'll see on the far right, the clasp was issued. I applied for it the year after he died and got it on behalf of the family, but I now have the Bomber Command clasp, which he should have got in 1945. The guys who did the Battle of Britain got one, but Bomber Command didn't. So it was one of those crazy things of time. I'm nearly there, so I'll just tell you a little bit more. They ended up, well, I would say, living happily ever after. They were lucky to have such a good son as I. I'm only joking. But they had a very happy life. My father retired at 54. He went on to work for Qantas. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But also, my mother came out to Australia. So there's a fair bit in the book about her. And can you imagine facing my father's terrible parents? And they took her to Tin Can Bay while my father was working with Qantas on trying to find a downed Lancaster. And his mother tries to teach my poor mother crabbing for these monster crabs in the mud of Tin Can Bay in Queensland. Now, you guys would appreciate that, you Queenslanders, but you had to grab the claw and then sort of hold the thing. Well, my mother had only ever lived in London, so, but she also did some amazing things, and she's to be admired. And, she's sort of, again, part of the story. But they were inseparable. They had 40 years of retirement, 94, 92 years of age dying. They were inseparable, and within 2 months of my father dying, my mother had gone. So, and she just, I'm sure, decided to go. There was nothing I could do. My father was recognised in New South Wales Parliament, and you've seen the story has been recommended by Sir Angus Houston in the book itself. Quickly tell you that he went on to Qantas. Haven't got much time left to tell you a lot about this, but I can cover this in question time if you want to. But he was recruited to Qantas in 45 by Scotty Allen. He flew Lancastrians, flying boats, Constellations, Super Constellations, the Boeing 707. He had 26 years with Qantas and 13 as the chief navigator. He had a 30-year career in the air, and he flew for 13,700 hours. He introduced Doppler navigation and inertial navigation systems, and he helped to computerize the Boeing 747. You'll probably all remember that the Jumbo was the first aircraft that didn't need a navigator. So he helped to make his own profession obsolete, basically, in his own lifetime. So he found his profession through the war, and then by the end of his working life, navigation on aircraft was no longer needed. They had computers to do it. And that's why I sort of think of him as the last navigator, not really his words, but In terms of major large aircraft, he to me was possibly the last navigator of sort of aircraft in a broad sense. I like this little bit sort of about the joy of flight. My father loved flying, and he had a love for the bush and the outdoors. So there's a bit of bird life there as well. And you can see what Leonardo has said. Once you've walked the earth and turned your eyes upwards, you'll long to be there forever. So that's certainly the way my father saw it. So I'm going to just finish with a little bit from the author's note as well, and it just says, my father's profession had brought him an unforgettable panoply, that's array, of the wonders of weather and nature as he faced his challenges in the air, seemingly skimming the surface of this spectacular globe, out into the blue, puffed clouds abounding. Last slide. I'm pleased to say this is a good book, a father and son collaboration, and I've got to say this is his story.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, many thanks for a very interesting presentation. I can highly recommend Paul's book. I already have a copy of the book. Where are we? There we go.
Bless you, bless you.
In fact, I've got 2 copies of the book. My son in Melbourne thought it was such a good book, he bought me one for Christmas. So I've now got 2 copies of the book. Paul, just a bit of an aside, by the way, one of our Queensland members, John Bentke, is actually related to Don Bennett. He talks about Don quite regularly. And as you know, Paul, my father-in-law was also in 460 Squadron, the same squadron your father was in, the 1st Squadron, and he actually flew G for George on a mission to Berlin. So, Paul, many thanks again. Has anyone got any questions for Paul? Paul, you might just stop your share as well, please.
Will do for sure.
There we go.
All done.
Yes, I have a question. Paul, you said at the beginning of your talk that your father opened up when he was in his 90s.
Yeah.
Have you any idea, was there an incident? What was the catalyst for him opening up after all those years, after all those decades and decades?
I think, well, I'd sort of retired and started to talk to him again, but I think as you get older, look, I'm not quite old enough yet to know this for sure, but I think as you get to your 90s, there are some memories that stick with you and come to the surface almost of your brain. It's a bit like what they argue with what you remember with dementia, but for him, he was really, he and Philip Patrick, both of them, they were really focused on what happened in World War II. And as I say, he was rereading Don Bennett's book that he wrote about Pathfinders, and I've got a beautiful copy. It's just a little book, but I've got his sort of shaky writing in the front of it. He's still writing little bits and pieces in the front of it, but it was such a defining moment, I think, in their lives that, I mean, why wouldn't you remember that? I suppose that.
Yes, I'm sure they remembered it, but that's what they did. They spent their entire lifetime. My old man was in the Second World War too, but he was in the Pacific, and they spent their entire lifetime trying to forget what they went through in their early 20s.
Yes, yes.
Why would they? What would change his mind to start talking about something he'd been trying to forget for decades and decades and decades?
Well, maybe it's a little bit of the sense of history or time, or that your time's up, or that there are things that you want to say or tell. But I was a little bit of a catalyst in a way, in that I was, I won't say egging him on, but I wanted to know more. I had his memoirs, but I wanted to know more about what was behind them, and I mean, I sort of felt it was important too, because you know, he was not getting any younger, and I mean, he lived a very good life and lived to a very good age, but he did just seem to actually be happy to talk about it. My mother used to explain to me all through his life, he used to still wake in the middle of the night having nightmares about claustrophobic nightmares that must have gone back to the war. So the brain was still sort of harvesting and going through all those experiences. And I suppose he wanted I was lucky that he was prepared to share them, I suppose.
Right. Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Yes. So you know, my mother's cousin trained in Canada too as a pilot, and he did, I think it was 17 bombing trips all over Europe, which apparently was rather remarkable. And I've got a map of all his flights from. So you know, found it very interesting, and I'm going to see if he can look at on the son can look at it on Facebook. It'd be good.
Fantastic, Morel.
Any other questions?
What you were saying before about what can bring on somebody talking about their wartime experiences from my own personal thing was a dream. I woke up in the mid 90s and I was dreaming about an incident in Vietnam actually, but I'd never talked much about Korea or Vietnam. I was 20 going on 16 in Korea and I was 34 going on 50 in Vietnam. And I just had this vivid dream of an incident in Vietnam, and I got up about 2 o'clock in the morning and wrote a story about it. And for the next dozen nights, I just got up. I didn't get up early. I started early, but I just kept writing all these stories from memories and just poured out. And it was therapeutic.
Yes.
I had nightmares after Korea as a 20-year-old going on 16.
Yep. Yes.
Firing napalm rockets at humans. Wasn't a very pleasant experience.
It makes very good sense to me, Lloyd, what you say.
Paul, it's Warwick Henry speaking. You mentioned Don Bennett a fair bit. Quite a few of our members will have met him because for a time Don Bennett was a patron for Queensland Air Museum, and I've met him through that, of course. I also happen to know 2 of Don Bennett's nephews who are cousins, and each happen to be friends of mine who are nephews of Don Bennett. He's certainly well known. And at Queensland Air Museum, there's a significant portion of the museum there is dedicated to Don Bennett with a lot of information about him.
Yeah. He is, to me, my father had a great admiration for him, and he met him, I think, on 3 or 4 occasions. I don't think Bennett got the recognition after the war that he should have, and but he absolutely admired him. Bennett was one to call a spade, as I understand it, and he didn't treat fools lightly, but he got the job done. And my father admired him for that reason. He just thought he was the right guy to have at that time.
Any other questions for Paul?
One I put up on the comments was most of that navigation done as celestial navigation. There would have been no nav aids.
They, in the early stages, yes, they, again, I don't present myself as an expert, but certainly astrofixers were part of it, plotting on a map as well. They had radar. As the war developed, they had radar that could track back to home, and they could actually guide the aircraft onto the target using radar. I think it was H2S was one, and GI was another. But they did have improved techniques. But going back to his Qantas days, I think he did describe to me that he felt that they didn't have much more than Captain Cook had when they were flying the Super Constellation. So, you know, in flying boats, he described to me the story of, oh, we didn't make that island, they'd say, because you're out over the ocean. At least in Europe, you know, you've got land and you can recognise things, but in a flying boat, you're out and over the sea, and they used to, if they didn't find the island when they should, they'd fly in a square until they found it, and then they'd head off again.
And my other question, you mentioned Arthur Doubleday, who I think I knew. Post-war, did he become an investigator with DCA of aviation accidents? Is the aviation career continued?
Yes, he went to Coolumon. There is a bit of a brief on him there, and I think Chased by the Sun by Hank Nelson's another one that this, gives a fair amount on Arthur. But he went back to his family property at Coolumon and with Phil, who was my mother's best friend from England, and they lived there for a while, but it's a very unforgiving life out there. So he, I think, goes to Brisbane, and I think sets up, joins the Civil Aviation Authority there, and I think ends up in Sydney I think heading up the whole thing. So that's my understanding. And funnily enough, I remember, because I live at Lindfield here in Sydney, and I remember Arthur's house, and it's just 2 streets down from where I live in Canberra Avenue. I remember going there.
Yeah, thanks.
You see, astronavigation had to continue for the long over water flying until you mentioned inertial navigation systems.
Yeah,
and Boeing 707s and 727s and quite a lot of others actually have a little periscope arrangement. It stands at the back of the cockpit and sticks a periscope up through which you can use to take star shots.
Okay.
And you stand on a movable step inside the airplane to get whatever height you needed for the height of the person to be able to look at it just right. And then the navigator would go off and do his calculations to confirm where you were at that time, and give course corrections as and if required until they got within radio navigation aid. Even with TAA, they had that when they used to use the 727s going to Cocos Island and Christmas Island, for example, or delivery flights across the Pacific.
Well, we take for granted these, you know, the not pylons. What do they call them? You know, the you can just guide the aircraft now with all the beacons, I suppose, that are available. But as you say, in those days, till very much later in the piece, the navigator was key. You know, if you didn't have a good navigator, my father used to, he would say to his guys, "I want you to be within 20 miles of the route." That was his the error that he aimed for, as he told me.
You know, you're talking about inertial navigation system, but before that, there was the Doppler navigator. Our A model C-130s had Doppler navigator, and it was quite remarkable how accurate that was. I remember flying from Perth to Cocos one time, and we just did it on Doppler, and we descended on time on what the Doppler navigator was saying, and we ended up about 8 miles north of Cocos, in a not bad place to do a 180 back to land. So it was quite a remarkable thing. Even on fairly calm water, it worked fairly well too.
Yes, yes.
Yes, I understand Ansett had Doppler in some of the 727s. TAA never used that. We had our navigators though for these long routes.
Okay, no other questions?
Well, just another one on that one that I picked up from my reading. When Qantas started flying the Indian Ocean route to South Africa, the flights had to go at night time so that they could get their navigation via the stars.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's you know, one assumes how easy it is navigating over water, but it's you know, because of our current experiences. But in those days, it was quite challenging. And for my father, I remember him saying it was easier over Europe than suddenly he's on an aircraft heading from London to Sydney via, you know, it wasn't Perth, there was another name for the airport, I've forgotten now, but and it was such long distances and a lot of it over water, which wasn't their experience in those days.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we might call it quits, but before we go, I might sort of give a plug for Paul's book. This is a web page I've got for the book, and
Thanks, Peter.
I've actually posted a link in the chat area to this page, and you can get it from Alan and Unwin for $32.99. So thanks again, Paul.
indeed.
I'll shut the session down as far as the recording. Yes, if we could just give Paul a round of applause. Thank you very much. And